Dear friends, good evening to all of you. Please allow me to thank my dear friend, Reverend Dev Jyoti Kumar, for this wonderful invitation that he has given to me yet again to be part of this movement of the National Council of Churches in India. Please also allow me to thank the General Secretary of the NCCI, Reverend Asir, as well as Father Thomas Nainan, who heads the desk for these wonderful, meaningful encounters that they have provided all of us to be part of this. Thank you very much, Jyoti, for your invitation. Dear friends, it's wonderful to see and meet all of you. You see very many familiar faces, and I really thank God for this opportunity that's given to us. Also, I certainly want to thank Mr. Vijayan Pillai for what he does to the NCCI and how he manages the communications as well. Thank you very much, Vijayan, for your own accompaniment. I would like to bring initial questions, initial thoughts that I myself has encountered, of course, in a limited time that I have spent until now, both in the church as well as in the academy, in the theological college, to be precise. And I would like to share, and I hope the screen would be visible in a moment, and that's what I'm hoping for. Please do let me know, Jyoti, if it does come up.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
visible. It's visible.
yeah, thank you. So the objective or objectives, if it may be, I can speak from the Department of Christian Ethics, being a student of Christian ethics, to see how this perspective of stigma regarding sexuality emerge within the discipline, quote unquote discipline of Christian ethics, to discern myths surrounding people who are LGBTQI plus, or from their own community, they would possibly would like to be known as SOGI community, sexual orientations and gender identities communities who face stigma, and then to listen compassionately to the voices of the people from the LGBTQI community, which certainly NCCI has done for all of us. The past hour has been extremely moving, and one thing I have certainly gained from listening to these friends is to not only compassionately hear them, but to see the immense victimization that they do undergo every day, every single day. And both Kashi and Sonal, I know they are not around, but then if they would open up, they would share some devastating experiences, which which is hard to take, to be honest. And then, of course, to discern a Christian inclusive paradigm. Inclusive is a problematic term, but we'll keep it for a while, and then we'll certainly try and question that as well. The Christian inclusive paradigm, irrespective of people's sexual and gender identities. There are initial student questions that these are questions that I have heard generally in class, and possibly it's the same questions that may reverberate in all of us. Okay, and these questions I'll probably post this, and we are all theological educators, fellow theological educators, and you certainly have heard very many other questions that may not be within this schema, but certainly would have heard this question. First thing, very clear question that comes to us: is it really true that people have different sexual identities? So students generally start with denial. The very many decades of women's studies have Dr. Nilamala Prasuna is here, and her work also is inspiring for all of us to hear that in the decades of women's studies, of what we have seen is this necessary denial of patriarchy that is generally encountered in students when students take the class on women's studies. And so is the case when issues of sexuality also come. So there is knowingly and also consciously, subconsciously, they do start with denial. And so many of us. And it leads to the more departmental question, how Christian ethics can accept, if I can put that word can, how Christian ethics can accept gender fluidity and sexual identities beyond the male and female binary. Okay. And of course, what will be the impact on other members of the church if we incorporate, we and incorporation is also problematic terms, but that is how the questions are. We'll keep that as it is. What will be the impact on other members of the church if we incorporate LGBTQI or SOGI communities in the church? So these are genuine questions. These are questions that come from a deep longing to learn. These are not necessarily questions of shutting themselves off from this, or the questions that certainly are problematic in various ways, but as we encountered, conscious questions that they have. So some students certainly know what is to be done, how it is. Okay, so this is what the lecturer needs, so I will write that perfectly to that lecturer, knowing that it's basically a matter of grades. So they do really well, okay, get all the what we call political correctness in the papers and in their assignments. And then of course we don't have any other choice but to mark them a high B plus or an A minus for that matter. So that is how it is. But then when they are still closeted, they still keep their denials, they still keep their prejudices, and then they graduate. So this is the task that we and also the struggle that we all find within our own institutions. And that is why, how did social, religious, theological, and political culture around the world in our own institutions, in our own theological spaces, develop so as to exclude persons of minority sexual orientations and gender identities from formal community? It happens. It happens physically. It happens symbolically, metaphorically. It does. And that is why we are all wanting to be in this task of trying to understand this. Of course, C.S. Song sought this challenge that theological education is facing today. I quote from his 2011 article, and he says this about Asian Christian institutions. He says, as far as I can see, Christian institutions in Asia, old and new, are standing on the crossroads, carrying business as usual with no viable alternatives. It's a very scathing critique of what we are doing today in our theological colleges, in the academy. We can paraphrase this by saying, as far as we can see, theological institutions in India, old and new, are standing on the crossroads, carrying business as usual with no viable alternatives. Which perhaps means that we are comfortable in recycling what we are doing and what is the requirement, as well as what the church needs. And that leads us to another, as I said, scathing critique from none other than A.P. Nirmal. Arvind P. Nirmal writes, theological education assumes the role of a factory whose job is to produce or manufacture that for which there is a demand and a market. The demand and the market are represented by the church. This view amounts to the church telling theological educators, give us what we want and manufacture your products to our order. Professor Nirmal goes further to say, basically, this is a capitalistic understanding or capitalist understanding of theological education and smacks of professionalism. And this is the critique that we have to answer to even today. We are not blaming the church. That is generally, that is a concern that is generally raised in our general body meetings when church representatives are there. Somehow you are saying things against the church. Not the case at all. This was said decades ago. And this is something that we also need to answer to. So if at all there needs to be a reimagination or a transformation, these critiques have to be addressed, even in terms of the way in which we understand, we discern what sexuality is, what church feels what sexuality needs to be, and whether there can be a conversation, as we have heard from the members of the community, especially Sonal, if he had been attentive right at the end of a presentation, she made this plea to the churches to be more receptive to the theological institutions, if I may rephrase her, to have this conversation going and not necessarily be in denial. Much earlier, right in the 12th to second or third century, Tertullian says the religious practice of one person neither harms nor helps another. It is not coercion that we should be led to religion. So there's this immense freedom that the early teachers of faith also spoke about in their own deliberations. They said any force that is meted upon and saying that this is what it is, absolutist way of understanding truth, would be certainly coercive, forceful. And this is what is the challenge that I have to personally guard against in what we do teach in our own classes. But because if we come with a prejudice, and if we are not convinced about something, we certainly fall into prejudice. And that is harmful. And if we force that upon those that we have been given charge of, especially the students, isn't it not coercion that we are leading them to a certain truth that we think is the truth? Listening to the early teachers of faith, again, we need to guard against that view, that prejudice should not come, which prejudice, when converted into coercion, would certainly be wrongful. And Richard Niebuhr's brother Reynard Niebuhr had warned us very many decades ago that there is a growing confessionalism in theological institutions. That Reynard Niebuhr says that the worst evils of history are derived not from pure selfishness, but from self-interest, clothed in the pretension of ideals. We might rephrase that: ideals as set doctrines, set standards, set practices, set understandings. That is what can be one of the worst evils if it goes against humanity, it goes against creation, when it goes against what God intends us to do. And therefore, we are to be guarding against very many of these critiques that are coming up of those who have encountered various aspects of truths in it. Okay? That's why Dayanandan makes this point that theologians and social discrimination, namely certainly prejudice and elitism. power itself cannot be understood or properly understood without comprehending the role of prejudice and elitism in providing religious and institutional sanction for all forms of discrimination. Prejudice and elitism also lead to pride, vice that adds to power of the oppressor. So all these are important for us to be clarified about our posture. I'm deliberately avoiding the word position. Position can be absolutist. Position can be a non-negotiable principle. This is my position, we say. I often hear this. This is the position that I stand. This is the position that I take. A position, as I said, cannot be conversant, but maybe a structure, maybe a posture as a word, wherein which we are forever open to the refreshing ways with which we encounter God and God's people. And again, Schussler Fiorenza did warn us about what is happening within the Bible as well, that if scriptural texts have served not only noble causes, but also to legitimate war, to nurture anti-Judaism and misogynism, to justify the exploitation of slavery, and to promote colonial dehumanization. And may I please add, prejudice against sexualities. Prejudice against sexualities. Then biblical scholarship must take the responsibility not only to interpret biblical texts in their historical context, but also to evaluate the construction of their historical worlds and symbolic universes in terms of religious set of values. So it is our task in order for us to see how legitimization has happened through scriptures in terms of sexualities as well. And that's why it brings us to the very core idea of Bible and ethics as well. This challenge of bridging this gap of what we call the problem of anachronism between the Bible and the world of today. Not that the world of today has so suddenly changed that it does not have any inkling with regard to, say, first century AD and a bit of a BC as well, if you're taking the Hebrew scriptures into account. And this is the problem that we face. And as Longnecker does say, that it argues that God has given prescriptive laws in the form of commandments and ordinances, which can be found both in the Old and the New Testaments. If people want to know what they should do, the laws of God stand objectively before them in written form, and they only have to refer to them. And as if it's a non-negotiable entity as we begin this in order to understand what sexuality is. So there it is, and this is where it comes, and it is clear that heteronormativity is correct, and any form of sexual diversities is can be incorrect, because that is how it is. So it's a clear position, in order to use that word, position that people take. My own good friend of mine, Karen Armstrong, of course, she's not published this. This was in the form of a working paper that she gave to us, in which she says, many still believe instinctively that there is violence, a violent essence inherent in religion, which inevitably radicalizes any conflict, whether it be heteronormativity with homosexuality, whatever conflict those are. It radicalizes it, because once combatants are convinced that God is on their side, compromise becomes impossible and cruelty knows no bounds. So when a particular position on sexuality is achieved, that is the end of the matter, because God is on our side, and those who are on the other side are certainly to be disregarded. Quotations from scriptures are also evident. Citations from church history, whatever those sources are that we would think, whether it be church history or traditions, whether it be scripture, whether it be reason or certainly revelation and experience, and very many other sources beyond that, are considered from a particular sexuality point of view. It becomes authoritative. And that's why what we see as sources for theologizing are also problematic in very many ways when we look at it from a sexuality point of view, knowing that these can be, as I said, valorized, justified, and perhaps, as Armstrong warns us, cruelty, both external and internal, whether it's physical, not perhaps in institutions and churches, but certainly symbolic violence is meted out against these communities who stand between being and nothingness, between the gap between being and nothingness, if we are to use a Freire's term, this blurring of the lines between being and nothingness that we experience, they stand at these crossroads. And when we speak about religion, it's so important that none of the religions may give us any form of directions. Tashi was saying that religion often becomes the site of oppression, whatever those religions are. And Arya Raja is right when he's speaking of this, when he says that no other social institution is more guilty of perpetrating, sustaining, and justifying unjust relations at the social level than religions themselves, Christianity including, theological institutions included. Confucianism and Shinto advocate a hierarchical society as a social vision. Hinduism gives scriptural justification to the caste system. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, despite the rethinking that is in progress, are hierarchical, patriarchal, heteronormative, if we can add that word, in their most common expressions. Even protest religions like Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism succumb to the pressure of power relations in their institutional manifestations. And therefore, the task for us is certainly to reread, to visit. I know reread has become a misnomer now, okay, cliche, but then we may reclaim that word again, perhaps, to see that we see social and ethical teachings, and to demythologize what we call the moral, to demythologize what we call the moral. And this saint is the patron saint of persons with sexual orientations and gender identities. Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian. And Horkheimer, the social theorist, we're reading Horkheimer very much nowadays, and he makes this point that the misery of the victim is thus the point of departure. So if we are to proceed with deliberating on an issue, if we are wanting to proceed with rediscovery of meanings and a journey of knowing, then we need to perhaps keep aside a little bit some of the sources that we use for theologizing, and certainly look at it from the point of the misery of the victim. Again, we are not essentializing victimization. We're not essentializing suffering. We are not codifying or valorizing suffering. That's not the point that Horkheimer makes. But then, where does it hurt? And that's why we always, when we ask students what is theology, they come up with Saint Anselm's definition of theology always: faith seeking understanding, faith seeking understanding all the time. But perhaps when we listen, or when we won't have to deliberate, when we have to discern aspects of sexuality, then theology may become Suffering seeking both faith and understanding. Misery seeking both faith and understanding as, as the task of theologizing. What does it mean? Again, the danger of essentializing suffering is there. You have already marked that out, bracket that out, pointed that out to one side. What does it mean to see faith in terms of, as I said, suffering, seeking both faith and understanding? Therefore, our task now today is to decenter the epistemologies that we have received. Epistemology slash IES, epistemologies. The epistemic violence against communities of gender diversities by the dominant is to be the point of entry as we begin this quest to understand, identify, specifically note the epistemic violence against communities. How does this epistemic violence happens? As I said, through all the sources of theology that we have taken for granted very many times, and also the emerging epistemic sources within our own religious communities, within our own confessional institutions, theological institutions. These epistemic violences are to be identified, unmasked, noted, and brought to discernment, brought to discernment. And we all know how Derrida actually gave this example of a lawyer. How do we open that text for us? It's as if the lawyer going around the accused, posing questions continuously until that accused breaks, and then truth flows out. To pose questions to the texts that we are receiving, these epistemic texts that go against communities of gender diversities and sexual orientations. Okay. To pose questions at them so much so for those texts that those texts, in Derrida's own words, break out and truth flows out. Finally breaks and then truth flows out. So to identify the epistemic violence, it manifests in multiple forms which privilege the epistemic agency and monopoly of the dominant and the theological legitimization that certainly follows it. And also this cognitive injustice as Soji knowledge systems and practices are challenged. You know, sexual the knowledge system that comes from persons and communities of sexual orientation and gender identities, and when that is denied, saying that these are not just only against the scriptures and against the law in very many places, but also that it is the branding of sin that comes. So when that is cognitive injustice, and that also needs to be unmasked, because the knowledge, the epistemic knowledge that comes from that side, from the marginal side, from the community, when that is denied, it is certainly, isn't it not cognitive injustice, which needs to, this knowledge system, not only in cerebral forms, for those in philosophy would understand this as a classic problem of a Cartesian worldview, which it certainly, and that's why Soji knowledge as informed by body mediated experiences. Again, women's studies and gender studies have always encouraged us to look at these experiences as body mediated experiences, and certainly lived experience as primary epistemological source for all of us. And that's why I really commend the NCCI for their graciousness and for their own journey of rediscovery, bringing the community in. And that is where we start. And that's the beautiful way in which I really commend dear Jyoti for this initiative, and the entire desk of the NCCI for this, as primary epistemological source. And this, what we do is simply reflect upon those sources, that these bodies are the sites of liberative knowledge, because it's the body that endures marginalization, stigma, and exclusion. Bringing Horkheimer in and saying the misery of the victim is the point of departure, nothing else. And that is an epistemological arena in which we traverse these dense but lived experiences, which overcomes, which hovers out, which transcends essentialism, and they become intentional about their own body mediated experiences, whether it be pleasure or certainly a lot of pain when they see it. The literary theorist that we don't read much, but we have to read her, especially in this version. I did see one of her books again, which on totalitarianism, which is certainly evident and important in today's discussion. When Arendt says about morality, this is a question that is raised: is morality the same as ethics? For those in Christian ethics who are here today, this is a struggle that we face in order to define what it means. Is morality the same as ethics? And this is a question that our students pose after a while of teaching. Can this be equated? Hannah Arendt writes, the fact that we use the words ethics and morals interchangeably in order to address questions of right, wrong, good, bad, is indicative of our confusion with terms. The very fact that we use that interchangeably, okay, morals are ethics, ethics are morals, is itself a confusion. She has warned us. And that's why it's so important to understand what this morality is that creeps into our knowledge systems, our epistemic systems, that finally define who people are and what they should be and how they should be. And that's why we continually say that we need to love our neighbors as they are, as they affirm to be. Because when we say to love others as our own, the danger that Jesus also foresaw and told his disciples through his parables is that we will place ourselves, our own epistemic knowledge, to see others, to love the neighbor as they are, as themselves. Is another point of entry in us. And we need to understand this. And that's where I leave for today. We just have about 9 minutes to go, including the question sessions. We have one more session to go, and that is where we truly come to how we can actually rise to the situation. But before that, we certainly need to understand the relationship between the perception of sexuality and moral evolution. And therefore, what we are getting now in terms of our own heteronormative nature, and to see that heteronormatively, that male and female binary is the only way in which we can understand it, and all other ways are sinful, is the way we connect sexuality and human beings' own moral evolution. Because height is important in this, that he says that any anti-procreation was met with disgust through human evolution. So basically, he has this idea that what happened was very many centuries earlier, when human beings began to live as communities, what did happen was that they were small communities and they had to guard against, before religion came in. Before certainly religion came in, we find that all these communities had to defend themselves from attacks from other communities, other groups, as well as other perceived dangers. And they wanted to have this group built up, so much so that procreation was one way in which they could ensure the group stability. And that is why, see, before religion came in, and that is why procreation was one means with which their own survival was achieved, their own survival was guaranteed. And that is why we would find that any form of barrenness, quote unquote, barrenness, impotency, eunuchism, or homosexuality was looked down upon, was certainly shut out, because it goes against forms of human solidarity as a group, as a group. And this particular idea, Haidt says, that emerged and then was injected into religion, and it became a code. You see the clear development as to how we began, and then how religion takes over after some time, and then it becomes codified, such so that it becomes justified through legitimated texts and belief system and doctrines and practices and traditions in order for this to be understood. And that is why the dominant reading that we get from Christian ethics is certainly heteronormativity, if you look at it very from. So this is the logic that is usually worked out. So falling back upon what we have done earlier in terms of understanding this moral evolution that has taken place, that posits any other sexualities as unacceptable, so much so, and provide scriptural texts in order to legitimate that particular notion that any other sexualities are impossible for us to accept, no matter what it is, all these. And that's why you have religious texts, not just in Christianity, but all other, if we go through a cross section of religious texts, and these communities who come, community friends who come from all these religious traditions, vouch for these texts that they have in their own religious traditions against barrenness, against impotency, against eunuchism, against homosexuality. Of course, there are perceptive texts, trajectories that run through scripture that are affirmative, certainly challenging all these notions, but then they are hard, they are swift. It's impossible to grasp very many of them. It's as if it's not simply searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. It is actually searching for one particular needle in millions of haystacks, millions of needle shacks, if I may to say so. And that's the difficulty that to find affirmative texts that actually say that these can be seen in a different way. And that's the challenge that we face because of the way in which we have given authority to the sources that we have. So I would stop here. It's just about 4 to 7. And then I look forward to your comments as well as your own supplement to what I have tried to put before all of us. And we'll certainly engage and continue with this conversation. Over to Jyoti.